Say it again. Right. Or what we perceive as the law. Right. 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 So let me ask you this though. Is he pointing to the law though? Because remember where we are. We're taught though. Moral perpetuity. Moral perpetuity is what we call it. Right. 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 So let's do it this way. You even mentioned, I think, a couple of weeks ago. Let's say Job is in year 100. Now, there's no way for me to prove that. So I'm just using a number. Year 100 after Adam was created. So for 2 generations, and I know it's more than that, and it's generation upon generation, because you can go back and look at Job's family and figure out how many generations. But let's just say year 100. So in year 100 in your family right now, 2024, in 1924, you could probably find somebody in your family that knew somebody that was living in 1924. And they would say, John, you know, they used to talk about great-grandma so-and-so or great-grandpa so-and-so. So that word is handed down to you. Let's see, they lived, I'm going to use, I think, what would be your heritage. They lived on the Indian reservation in this particular area, and then go on with the story. So now, great-great-grandmother, or grandfather, we'll say grandfather, has handed it down to grandson, and now it's down to you. So same with this case, and my thought is that traditionalism that Bildad is following, and what he says is, listen, look back at what happened with Adam, with Granny and Grandpa. Let's do it that way. We'll put it in Mill Hill term. Look back at what happened to great-granny and grandpa. You remember when God created them, because we're not that far out now, when God created them, there was a moral compass. And when sin entered into the world, God said, do not eat of that tree. Eat of everything you want to, do not eat of the one. And they decided. So now what I've got is, when we're talking about the conversations that we have, we're not living by the law, we're living by the penalty that Adam and Eve received. Because there's no law written. We believe there's no law written as of yet. So the penalty that we can talk back about, that they lived on the Indian reservations in 1924, and the things that happened with them, just out of the late 1800s, where we saw that our ancestors had to fight for their country and fight for what they believed. So that is handed down through 3 generations or 4 generations. And now what has happened is Bildad, as an old man, let's say, and once again, I cannot prove the number I'm going to use. Bildad is 80 years old. And Bildad says, I can remember when I was a little boy how they talked about, my great-grandpa talked about how it was when Adam and Eve was punished. And so that's the moral perpetuity that comes down with that. In other words, Bildad is saying, listen, if you don't get right, you're going to get... Now, let me rephrase that. I don't want to say Bildad. I don't want to put words in the Bible. My thought is, Bildad is using that as an example of saying, listen, because of where you're out of God's will. And if you're out of God's will, you're wicked. That's what he's saying. Let's go all the way back to Adam and Eve. Let me ask you a question. Was Adam and Eve wicked? But they were, right? Could we call Adam and Eve wicked? Because, now, it was Adam and Eve in God's sight? Absolutely. Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God. Now, once again, out of the book of Brian, Mill Hill version. They held hands and walked around with God in the garden. And when they were there with him, we see that those sins that they committed caused them to be wicked. Now, Bildad's looking back at great-great-great-grandma Adam, or Grandpa Adam and Grandma Eve. And he's saying, listen, I remember the stories when I was a little boy that they used to tell us, that Adam and Eve, our grandfather, our ancestors, did this in God's sight, and they became wicked. Look at what he says next. I think that ties in great. In verse number 4, he teareth himself in his anger. Shall the earth be forsaken for thee, and shall the rock be removed out of his place, or out of his place? Here's what he tells Job. You need to let go of that anger you got. Because what he's looking at, he's going back into chapter 16. And when Job is talking about all the death and stuff that's coming and how life is so horrible, Bildad's telling him, said, listen, you need to get rid of that. You need to get rid of the anger. Job, and he tells Job he's destroying himself, and that is, Job, you're destroying yourself, and that is your issue that has separated you from God. Whatever you're doing has separated you from God. Now let me say this, I want to stop right here. How many of you believe that these three men really loved Job? I believe the love. Now, when we've argued this whole thing, and I've talked bad about Bildad and the other two men that are there with him, and I just have to say, it don't seem to me like it cared much for him. But just think of this: how much do you love your family members? You'd do whatever you had to keep from going to hell. I believe that's where these men are. Right.
Just like I said a while ago, you're saying he was a traditional type guy.
Right.
Right. If tradition is the word we're going to use that as a balance between one side and the other. You got obedience when God loves. You got religion, which is following God's word.
Right.
Right. Which one is correct?
Obedience.
Every time.
Better to be obedient than sacrifice. Right.
You've not been obedient to God, therefore you're having this problem with the law.
Right. 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 So here's what he says to him, though. Well, let me go back to where I was at. They have to love him so much that they're doing everything they can to keep their friend from dying and going to hell. Now, let me say that's in in the New Testament word. I don't think that we could look at that in the Old Testament word because of where they are now. Because, let's be honest, did they believe? Well, Job did. Job believed that there was another place he was going. But that's not a common knowledge of that day. Sure. Let me ask you this. Stand up, Ethan. We're going, sir? Constructive criticism. All right. Here's your son, Ethan. Here's your son, Ethan. That is a drunk, a womanizer, a drug addict. But let me finish. And he is so wrapped up in sin. Do you not love him enough to go to him and say, Ethan, everything you're doing is wrong? So wait a minute, let's stop right there. Now you're a nosy neighbor. You get where I'm so hold on. All right. Right. 100%. 100%. But you got to remember, the three men did not know the conversation that went on in heaven. I'll get you in. Religion on the other.
Religion is God's word, following God's word. What makes God's word none better? Religion.
Exactly.
God loves obedience.
How long did the three of them come and sit with Joseph before he came to
7 days.
7 days? You're not going to sit, you're not going to be a nosy neighbor for 7 days and sit there and say,
Now, let me go back to the example I made with Ethan and Jeremy. You know what Ethan's sin is. Bildad thought he knew what Job's was.
See, there's still a difference. I'm going to go to Ethan and I'm going to say, son, I love you. I don't want to see you in this kind of shape. You don't die, you don't go to hell. You know, if you don't get straightened out, if you don't get saved. I'm going to try to show him as much love as I can. I ain't going to sit there and try to name off all the laws he's broken and everything he's done.
Well, as hard as it may be, sometimes you gotta do it the right way. And I'm not saying these men handled it the best way possible.
Dad, I'll be back. He'll tell me what I did wrong.
Yes.
Well, let me put it like this then. Let's just say something terrible happened to me. Y'all gonna come to me and say, I know you sin. What was it?
Well, you also
But we live, once again,
Get that right, Jeremy. Everything is straightened out.
but let's look at where we are. We're in the New Testament age. They're in the Old Testament age. So the law, if you will, would have been different. Say again? And they're looking at it as sin.
What are they looking at? That's what
Say again? Right. So this whole discourse is about Job's sin. There's no doubt about it.
the word of tradition, according to this, in that time, God chastised when he did. It's because they got out of his will.
Right.
That's what they're looking at. They're right. They're looking at it through the law's eyes, but they're not looking at it through the eyes of obedience.
Right.
God's love.
Right.
I agree with what you're saying, but what I'm saying here, though, that you can see my sin, and you follow me around long enough, I promise you'll find one. Yeah. That's why I'm saying that Job was upright, righteous, perfect. God died, he had no sin. I think the big thing was that he knew the whole concept.
Exactly.
I feel like Job had sin because he had put enough offerings for his children to have sin by sin. There's sin there.
You cannot answer for somebody else's sin.
Here's the good one. Here's the good one. This is the New Testament. He said, David, a man after my own heart. And look at all the laws he broke. I agree. You can see it. They can't call nothing out of it. He said, no, he was a man after my own. They would do it upright man.
In verse number,
That's on different places where he said that about different guys. But yeah, they were still sinners. I'm gonna say they probably had a little bit of resentment for him because Job was calling him beast. Yeah. So they probably had a little bit of resentment towards him on that part.
so let me ask you the question then, Dustin. I'm glad you're there. So do we not do that? You're saying that if Ethan's doing something wrong, I'm going to go to him and tell him how much I love him and that I'm going to help him get to where he needs to be. Well, not everybody does that. Because I can promise you, when they get out of God's will, some folks right away look for the worst in everybody. And I believe that's the three men that we're looking at now. Now, is it nosy neighbor syndrome? Could have been. I mean, let's be honest. But from the context of us trying to learn how Christian life is, what we need to look at, what I think we need to look at and see is how, one, do they love him enough to scold him for everything he's doing? Because I promise you this, if my boys get out of line and your girls get out of line, first thing I'll do is they're going to get scolded. Now, does that mean that you don't love them? No, it don't. But what it means is you're going to look, not all of us, I'm going to use me and John. Me and John are not going to sugarcoat it for you. When we tell you what's wrong, we're going to tell you what's wrong. I'm not going to come by and tell you, Jeremy, now listen, you know, that's me and John. And, yeah, Jimmy going to hug you. But see, not everybody's like that. You're going to look at some people in your Christian walk, and those people are going to go, I knew it he was going to do it. I knowed he was going to do it. And I'm going to tell him about it too. That's right. Go ahead, Ethan.
part of the thing is these men may have started with good intentions because if you notice their tone starts to get more intense and
Right.
aggressive go on. It's very much more aggressive. And I
Well, what? I agree 100%. I agree with Jeremy 100%. But let me ask you this. How many times am I going to have to carry you before I finally say, look? They sat for 7 days and didn't say nothing to him. But that's true. No, they hard. They me and Jimmy. I mean me and John. They're me and John. They ain't Jimmy. Remember what I said in chapter 13. Don't you think that these three men should have come to Job, sat down beside him and said, look here, brother, I cannot imagine what you've gone through. That's where they're at now. We've made it there. Yeah. Exactly. Because he will not, because listen, Job knows he did not do anything wrong. So he don't have to answer for something he did not do wrong. My buddies think I should.
What stands out to me with that is that if Job had bowed before God, it's like, Lord, I've sinned, I've done this, I've never there. It would have been, hey, faith, because
Right, right. You're gonna love my notes at the end of this. Look, on verse number 4, let's go back to 4 again. He teareth himself into anger. Now listen what you hear what Job just said? You making your own self mad. That's what he said to him. That's what Bildad just said to Job. You making your own self mad. He teareth into anger, in his anger. Shall the earth be forsaken for thee? In other words, when he asked him in that question, and shall the rock be removed out of its place? When he tells Job to let go of the anger and he's destroying himself, and that's what separated him from God. Here's what he says. Do you expect in that center part of the verse, shall the earth be forsaken for thee? Do you expect God to stop everything he's doing to come down to you? That's what he's asking. Do you think God's just going to stop everything in the universe and come and look at you? Because here's what he's done. In chapter number 17, in verses 10 through 16, here's what he did. He said, man, I'd just soon be dead and in the grave. And they say, well, do you think God's going to stop everything in the world just because you feel bad? See, when we as Christians look at that and say, well, you know, I think God should let me rephrase it. How do I want to say this? I think we as Christians think when we get saved, or we as people are new converts, or people that say, God's supposed to move everything out of the way. If we're serving a thrice holy God, a good sovereign God, then we shouldn't have to suffer, right? We shouldn't have any issues because we're saved. I've done what God said to do. And here Bildad says, listen, I'm going to tell you this. God saved you, but the world ain't going to stop for you. I want you to understand that. Because he's not going to move every rock out of your way to keep you from tripping over it. And Bildad tells him, says, listen, God's not going to stop the universe just to come and take care of one person, but he does. Remember that. He knows your troubles and trials, and he knows when you need him. And he will be there. And the thing is that Job is in such a position, and he's so weary, and he's so worn, and he's so tired, and Bildad and his friends look at him and say, listen, that's your problem. You have separated yourself away from God, so that makes you wicked. Listen to what he said. Now he goes in verse 5. He changes discourse. Yea, the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of the fire shall not shine. The light shall be dark in his tabernacle, and his candle shall be put out with him. The steps of his strength shall be straightened, and his own counsel shall cast him down. For he is cast into a net by his feet. I want to hold off on that one. In those 3 verses, here's what he tells him. Be careful what you say, Job. Because remember, in chapter number 17, Job made the statement, I would welcome the grave. Now let me tell you where we're at here in today's society. when we get so down and out that we just said, man, I just wish I'd go ahead and die.
Job goes as far as to say he wishes he'd never been born before.
Right. Here's what happens. Man, I just wish I'd die. Your light is extinguished as soon as you die. Your legacy's still here, but your light's gone. See, you can't go up to a little kid and say, son, let me tell you about what it was like when I was your age and what I did to give my heart and life to Christ and how I trusted him as Savior. See, that light's gone once you're in the grave. Your legacy still lives, but your light's out. And that's what he's telling Job. You need to be careful what you're saying, because you need to understand that when your light is turned out, there's nothing else you can do. You can't be a light for anybody else. All you're going to be then is a legacy for somebody. Man, my grandpa was one of the best men. Red Staten was one of the best men I've ever met in my life. He was as godly a man as you'll ever meet. He is one of the, never read a word, never had a driver's license, walked everywhere he went, and loved the Lord more than anybody I've ever met in my life. And you know that same person. You can look and go, my mama, my grandmother, this person, that person. You can do the same thing. But you know what? Red's light don't shine no more. But his legacy's still here, because he lives on in my great-grandson, or in his great-grandson, who is my grandson now. See, that legacy that we're teaching Shrib is a legacy that Angie's daddy gave us. But now the light that he had, it's gone, because he can't share it with anybody else. And what Bildad is telling Job, says, listen, you know what? God ain't going to come down to you whenever you struggle every time. But he's going to be there, I promise you. But be careful, because the light of the wicked shall be put out, and the spark of the fire shall not shine. He's telling him, says, listen, when you're dead, and because of wickedness. Now let me say that. In these verses, he's telling Job, because you're wicked. And that is because he believes within his heart that Job is separated from God, which makes him wicked. Because your wicked light is going to die, or it will die out whenever you're in the grave. So you need to be careful. Verse number 8, for he is cast into a net by his own feet, and he walketh upon a snare. The gin, or the trap, that's what a gin is, it's a trap. The gin shall take him by the heel, and the robber, when we read that word robber, we think that as a robber. That's not what that is. I got a great example of that. Now he said the gin is going to be a trap to you. Can I use you, Ethan? You sit still. And then he says that the robber is going to be a snare. That word robber means a veil. So what he's saying is, how many of you ever watched old Tarzan movies when we were little? Whenever somebody's running through and they got that big net, that's a veil. You can take that off. That's a robber. You can throw it back up behind you. So what it does, it encompasses him in. See, what's going to happen is you're going to trap your own self. Your wickedness is going to trap yourself, and then you're going to be engulfed in your sin. That's what he's telling you. And because of that wickedness that you're living in, you're separated away from God. And he's not wrong. I want to go back and where I started at from the beginning. He says, you will be the reason that you're caught in your own sin. He says, you are the reason you are where you are. The snare is laid for him in the ground, and the trap for him in the way. In other words, you laid your own trap, and you followed your own footsteps that have led to you being captured in this sin that you're in right now. See, once again, I want everybody to understand, Bildad has no idea about the conversation. That God said, have you considered my servant Job? All Bildad says is you're separated from God. Wickedness. Now, if we went back in Job's same day, and let's say we use Jimmy Swaggart. Jimmy Swaggart has been a dynamic pastor and preacher. Preached like no other. Got caught up in that snare. So in Bildad's day, what would they have done? They wouldn't have come to him and said, man, I can't believe that happened to you. I'm praying for you and tell you, man, I'm praying for you, hoping God repairs everything. They wouldn't have done that. They would have said, Jimmy, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. And because of your wickedness, now because of the sin you've got, because of the sin that we know you've got, that's why you're separated from God. And see, that's what he called it. He said, you're wicked because of the trap you've allowed yourself to get caught in. And it makes sense to the Christian in the New Testament age, I think. Because when we begin to separate ourselves from God, we don't want to look at wickedness like that anymore. Uh-oh. Hedge. Are you asking me, do I think he sinned in the interim? In between, hey, consider my servant Job, and then what's happening to him?
After that point, God said, all protection happened. Back away from took his hands off the judge. He said, all right, Judge, if you're going to walk, you're going to have to walk straight by yourself.
I'm going to say no. What'd God say about him?
And before that, that's what God said. He said the same thing about David. Look what David done. He said everybody celebrated them. Look what they done. They sinned. My thing is, we got the Holy Spirit living inside of us now. We got Jesus, stepping in his snare, veils.
Right, right.
If we can't do it with the Holy Spirit living inside of us, now we don't do it. Yeah. You get what I'm saying?
But Tanya makes a great point. And the men that you talked about, he said, my servant Job is perfect. He was. All right, so do you think, so you're saying that imperfection waned?
He said, David, a man after my own heart. You look at all the stuff David done in his time.
What time is it?
That's king. See what I'm saying?
Right.
It don't, it's just a question that God took the protection down. He took his hands off. He said, all right, Judge, you're going to have to walk this way yourself. Why Satan had full blast on him.
I think something stands out with David. Yes, he sinned horribly, but he had a very repentant heart as well. And granted,
So, here's another one.
he stayed in that sin, and he tried to cover that up and everything until Nathan.
Not there was he, there's several different ones.
Well, no, I'm speaking general here, but until Nathan the prophet calls him out, as soon as he was told, the man in this story that I'm giving you, that's you. David had a repentant heart. David turned back to God. He felt very remorseful for his actions and he just followed God. Granted, was he perfect after that? No, absolutely not. But it's the idea of his repentant heart, the idea that he had a pure heart toward God rather than.
I guess the question I asked when I was Sunday school class, say Judge did walk first. We're going to submit again.
Yeah.
How did he do it?
I wish I knew.
That's right.
Trying to figure out what he did and then he had to know what he did.
I put myself kind of like a Job's shoes. We got the Holy Spirit living on the inside of God himself. Like we just, they didn't have that. It come and go, but it didn't stay with them like it does with us.
I often wonder how they were living under the Old Testament covenant a lot of times. Because we with under Jesus, and again, like you said, the Holy Spirit got us. We have a lot going for us.
Right.
A whole
And
lot.
yet we still struggle. And yet we still struggle. How did Job do it?
Better man than me is all I can say, John.
The greater question really than, well, they picking on Job. My question would be, Job, how did you do it? If I said in heaven right done that, that's what I would ask them. Yeah, they were mean to you, but how did you do it? Well, I want to know.
Let me read this notes and we'll be done. This shows a great example. I'm speaking of Bildad now. It shows a great example of how we as Christians have a great habit and a great way of poking the bear. See, when we see that to have people understand that we believe coming back, or what we believe is coming back to bite us, Job belittled them earlier in earlier chapters about how they reacted to him. And here they are now poking the bear. And see, yeah, depending on how long the stick is. And this is what I see from this whole discourse here with him, is that Bildad is in a position where he's saying, you're wrong. And the whole thing is told. They're in a position of good, godly Baptist Christian today that I've heard Doc say it time and time again. God's army is the only army that when their members or their friends or whatever, the people in God's army, they destroy one another before they will anybody else. So they'll fight one another before they will anybody else, or harm one another before they will anybody else. Yep. And so here is a great example of how we as Christians should not do. That belittle people simply because their life ain't what we think it ought to be. And we're all guilty of it. We look at the drunkard and say, oh, I would never do that. We look at the drug addict, oh, I would never do that. Or the homosexual and say, oh, I'd never be that way. You don't know. Pride before the fall. Or sin is sin.
No matter what you look at another person, if you look at your own life, you're going to find some sin there regardless.
I made mention of a guy that me and Deb used to know. He said he did not sin. He said, I don't know how to sin. He said I agree. He said he went to Myrtle Beach one time. He and his wife and children went to Myrtle Beach one time. He stayed in the room the whole 5 days they were there because he didn't want to sin by looking at women walking down the beach. Now let me say this. It's not a sin to watch a woman walk down the beach, but it's just a sin to watch her twice. See, if I look up and see wait a minute. No, it's all. I knew it wasn't on. But look, here's my point. Here's my point being is what he did was he automatically equated that if I go to the beach, I'm going to sin. Well, that's true too. That's true too. Judy, don't tell on Doc. Don't tell on Jimmy. Listen, if you look at sport, if you stand at the grocery store and you pick up a magazine and you open up that magazine and you're looking at the pages in that magazine, there's nothing wrong with that until you reach and tear the picture out. There's nothing wrong with it until you tear the pages out. Well, that's true too. They don't have magazines in the grocery store that you're looking at. Wait a minute. There's some words of wisdom coming, y'all. Hold on a minute. Yeah.
I want to go back to Brian's question. He said, you didn't see that you tore the paper out, right? So you had physically make an action to reach the sin. Is what you're saying?
Nah, I know I'm going to say yeah, and then John's going to catch me in a lie. What he's going to do.
Also said, if we look and lust in our eye, you see it.
Well, yeah, that's my point of going back to if you look at her twice. Right. It's but the act of looking twice is the sin. Just as if the act of tearing the page out of it. Uh-oh. Jimmy, be careful what you say now. No, we make sure that ain't on. Listen. You gotta hear the rest of the story first, though. Listen to the rest of the story. See, Judy calls Jimmy to sin. Yeah. Yeah, we need to go. Amazing grace. Listen. I want to go back to the question when John was talking about, and then we're going to be done because I know it's late. But I hadn't seen the bus come back, so we're good. When John was talking about, did I think Job sinned? Let's say no. And I just want to say no as a reason. But I want to look at it like this. Don't think about the age that we live in now. Because you can pick up the little magic box and sin all day. Let me finish. Job didn't have all of that thrown at him. Now, did he have moral perpetuity? Yes. He could have looked at morality and said, man, I'm going to sin or whatever this is. But he didn't have a television to corrode his mind. He didn't have drugs. He didn't have the sex. He didn't have the everything else that we see openly every day. So let me say it this way. If you live on a deserted island, you're the only person there. You and chickens. All right. So you're the only person there. Do you have the opportunity to sin as much as me? And I live in a big city where women walk around with no clothes on, where sin just runs rampant, where I've got the little magic box that I can look at whatever I want to all day. You don't have that opportunity to do all that. Where? Say again?
Same sins, just more ways to do it.
Well, he kind of broke that down to two different questions. He said, because the technology and stuff we got today is more, you're causing it to commit sin than it was back then. I disagree with that because he told Solomon there's not been one sin committed on the Sunday that had already been committed before.
Right.
So that would break Solomon's day. So whatever we commit today was already done back then.
Right.
It may be done in a different fashion.
Well,
Still done the same way.
you got to look at the umbrella that a sin comes under. So, right. I'm just saying though, when you look from a biblical standpoint of what sin was then, which is still sin. I don't want to say it like it ain't no more. You look at the umbrella. So, could Job have lusted? Yes, it was under the umbrella of obviously women or whatever word you want to put on. What? Say again? Lustful sin. So it's under that umbrella. So those sins that are under those umbrellas are absolute. They've always been here. And so when we look at, going back to Adam and Eve, when we look at the sin that Adam and Eve committed, that encompassed every sin. So you have, it's kind of like chambers. You got all the sins, and then they work in the chambers, and they're under umbrellas, and ultimately it comes back to one umbrella. And that's the sin that Adam and Eve committed in the garden. And that sin was not eating an apple. Let me say that. That sin was going against God's word and what God said. Now the act was eating a forbidden fruit. We know that. But the sin was God said, do not do this. So they went against what God said. That was the sin, and ultimately the sin. And so when we look at the accomplishment, I think that Job, as Jeremy mentioned earlier, I think if Job is on the backside of a mountain, remember where he was at. He was in the middle of nowhere, in a deserted place in the mountains, if you will. And so sin wasn't as prominent. You know, women wasn't walking around in bathing suits down by Job's house. And so, or they may not have been a traveling salesman selling liquor or whatever, just pick something. They wasn't walking around with stones that you could hear radios with or hear songs with. So the sin was not as prominent and not as apt to be committed as it is today, I think. But which you have more opportunity, and it's just pushed on us all day long because we live in a world of wickedness now. Morals, I think moral perpetuity came whenever they were pushed out of the garden, and at some point between there and Noah, I think moral perpetuity come in because we did not have the law. Because if we look in the backwoods, and we love to point towards Africa and say, well, tribesmen that live way out in the bush in Africa that have never heard the word of God, they've got a moral compass within them that says there's something greater. If you look at the American Indian, they had the indigenous peoples. Now we're talking hundreds and hundreds of years ago. They didn't worship Jesus. What they worshiped, television shows it as a great white spirit. So they had a moral compass within them that says there's something that's greater than me. And obviously, in that early days of civilization, there was something that said there's a higher purpose. And where did that come from? Let's go back to Bildad. Because great grandma and grandpa, Adam and Eve, they were punished because of sin in their relationship with God. And so that punishment, we remember that, even 6,000 years later, or ever how long ago it's been. Yes. Right. God is still God.